I took the title of Heather's presentation today as a tacit invitation to make a little mischief of my own. I'd like to start by acknowledging Heather's family, both the one she was raised in and the one she created with her husband, Kane. Her mother, Joanne, is here with us today, and I am sure that her beloved father, Val, who passed in 2021, is watching from that great art museum in the sky. And I love this father-daughter portrait of them. And here is Kane and Heather's six-pack. George, Henry, Lucy, Gage, Annie, and Calvin, some of whom are here today. As you can see, they are a lovely family. Now, I've been thinking about this introduction ever since Heather asked me to do it last semester. There's too much good to be said about Heather to even know where to start. She has published, at my last count, 16 articles, edited 2 books, co-authored a book with Corey Cropper and Dana Lee, and is now working on 3 different monographs. One about Minerva Teichert, one about Utah women artists, and one about women's fashion in post-revolutionary Paris. She's given dozens of talks, both at academic conferences and at public humanities events. She has received many grants and awards for her research. She is also a beloved mentor and teacher on campus. But rather than using this time to rehearse the particulars of her impressive CV, I'd like to talk about yet another thing that I admire about Heather, and that is her style. If ASR stood for Annual Sartorial Report instead of Annual Stewardship Report, Heather would earn perfect scores every year. Case in point, she owns this necklace. If I ever feel deficient because I don't have the panache that Heather does, I remind myself that no one dresses as well as Heather does, except for, of course, Scott Miller and whoever the next dean is. In other words, Heather not only knows art, she is art. And she creates art wherever she goes. Take, for example, this series of photos I lifted from her social media accounts. I love this sequence of accidental triptychs. It's like looking at the Ghent altarpiece here. All of them feature Heather as the center panel. I think that Heather can't help but produce art, perhaps sometimes without even realizing it. Another example is this photo taken in October 2023. This was at a dinner I organized during the 19th Century French Studies Conference in Baltimore that year. And as you can see, only 2 of us are paying attention to the photographer, and the camera seems to have caught Heather at an awkward moment. But I remember exactly what she was doing when this photo was taken. She was trying to describe an elaborate headdress in one of the many portraits of women painted by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. I don't remember which work she was describing. It was a tough thing actually to narrow down. It could have been any of these or none of these. I prefer the woman at the top right who appears to be posing for a portrait in front of an erupting volcano. Is that right? Am I reading that right? Okay. I guess that explains the long face. But Ingres was not the only 19th century painter invoked at that dinner. When I saw this photo, it immediately reminded me of Luncheon of the Voting Party by Pierre-Auguste Renoir, or the guy I like to call the Thomas Kincaid of French Impressionists. And while I do not care for Renoir's overly precious style or for his malignant misogyny, you know, Heather feels the same way, the parallels between the 2 images are striking. They both featured used dishes on a table. There are multiple focal points in both. It's somewhat of a chaotic composition. But there still is this general feeling of exuberance. This was such a fun night, but this photo from the beginning of the dinner marks the moment that I saw that this was maybe not a great look for a couple of BYU professors who had just published a book on polygamy. But optics has always been and will always be a fundamental part of teaching visual media at BYU. It's been nearly 30 years, but the Rodin debacle still reminds us of how carefully these things must be framed, how judiciously we must present content that may make our students uncomfortable in some ways, but is also good for their intellectual and spiritual growth, how thoughtfully and patiently we need to engage non-specialists about our areas of expertise, and when it comes to art, how clearly we need to explain that this dynamic involves not only what we're looking at, but how we're looking at it. Just to be safe. So these questions made me appreciate the kind of work, delicate work that Heather does in the classroom and how adept she is at leading students through challenging topics. Of course, if you're going to tread lightly around these questions, you're going to need a fabulous pair of shoes. Smoky Mountain sage and bedazzled icon Dolly Parton is known for, among other things, her aphorisms. This is one of my favorites, second only to "it takes a lot of money to look this cheap." We only need to make the slightest modification to Dolly's words to capture Heather's analogous philosophy about footwear. Heather's shoes are a distillation of her overall style. They are audacious, distinct, and always elevated. They are themselves works of art. Some of the images you're seeing I took from her social media feeds, and some of them I actually took myself, which means I've been taking surreptitious pictures of Heather's feet for a couple of months now. Did you ever notice? I'm sure there's a well-deserved restraining order in my very near future. I can't think of a better representation of how Heather contributes to the life of the university than her shoes. She has trekked across Europe as the director of over a dozen study abroad programs. In her scholarship, she moves among disciplines with enviable ease. After 6 years as European Studies Coordinator, and in her current capacity as Global Women's Studies Coordinator, Heather has undoubtedly logged hundreds of miles going back and forth between the JFSB and the Kennedy Center. And we could certainly spend all day admiring Heather's shoe collection, but the pair that I would like to conclude with are these. So here, Heather is joined in this photo by friends Julie Allen and Kif Augustine Adams from the law school. And while you will never see Heather on campus in anything nearly this ergonomic, I believe that this pair of shoes exemplifies the essence of who Heather is. In June of 2022, Heather, Julie, and Kif completed St. Patrick's Way in Northern Ireland, walking over 100 miles in just 8 days. Heather organized the pilgrimage as a way to celebrate both her 50th birthday and the end of her year-long treatment for breast cancer. Heather also used this journey to honor our beloved friend, Randy Siegfried, who was a scholar of Irish literature and who passed away after her battle with breast cancer 4 years ago last week. Heather, Julie, and Kif lit candles and placed this cross at Down Cathedral as a memorial for our friend. But I also think it was also probably a symbol of gratitude for the divine sacrifice that consoles us and promises us a joyful reunion with loved ones in the next life. So while hiking boots might not seem exactly on brand for Heather, this pair totally is. When she needed solace, she sought it out, but she made sure to bring her friends along with her so that they could also receive of this grace. That is the essence of who Heather is, always anxiously engaged in a good cause, no matter the circumstance, no matter the dress code or the location, on land, in the air, or under the sea. Heather, thank you for your friendship, your scholarship, your mentorship, and especially your discipleship. And may these fabulous heels be in your very near future.
The image before us is many things, not the least of which is a manifestation of hope. In the waning years of the Revolution, French citizens held hope for peace and prosperity, for national regeneration, and for increased opportunities for individual growth. Hubert Robert's project for a gallery at the Louvre teems with the sentiment of possibility and return to cultural civility, as embodied in the activity of wandering through the galleries of what once was the royal collection, and which was now something that belonged to the people. The artist is imagining what the space might become, a meeting ground for folks from various stations of life, men, women, and children, the young and aged, those already well-versed in artistic matters, and those hoping to become so. In the right foreground is a venerable artist copying an old master painting. Behind him are two women watching, one gesticulating to the other to look at the canvas. Meandering down the hall is a woman with a young boy pulling her toward a painting that's piqued his interest. To their left is a group of women. A matron in black gazes at the sculpture before her, while a young woman and girl, clad in the ubiquitous white gowns of the bourgeoises, look over the shoulder of another woman who is bent intently over her sketching pad, seemingly oblivious to their watchful presence. Patches of blue sky peek through the skylights and bathe the grand gallery in a cool, even light that draws our eyes down the massive corridor. What the artist has created is a site holding much potential, with women positioned to become the biggest benefactors of this brave new world. Most narratives devoted to post-revolutionary culture stress this androcentrism and concomitant denigration of women as participants in the formation of the new France. An emphasis is placed on the notorious chauvinism of Napoleon, and it was extensive. The Civil Code of 1804, a legal system which stripped women of any political rights gained during the Revolution, is referred to frequently in discussions of women's place in early 19th century France. Philosophical and pseudo-scientific discourses intoned that women were defined by and beholden to her bodily functionalism. At first glance, these predilections seem to be mirrored in the field of art, where the circle of artist Jacques-Louis David formed a homosocial network that spawned painters with single-minded devotion to championing the state. Such castings, however, ignore the subtle shifts in the cultural terrain that facilitated the movement of women into roles and spheres of influence heretofore assigned mostly to men. The Art Museum and its auxiliaries constituted perhaps the most promising space for women to stake claim for their cultural authority. Central to my argument is the positing that the museum absorbed various arenas over which women ruled during the Ancien Regime, including marketplaces, sacred sites, and salons, with a lowercase s, so intellectual gatherings, right? The tropes of conversing, shopping, and worshiping, public activities deemed not only suitable but necessary for women to perform, figured prominently into period discourse. The confluence of these women-centric spaces in Napoleonic museums, I maintain, worked to normalize the increased presence of women artists, viewers, and critics. And because the various dynamics of production and consumption in these spaces and what these meant for the formation of cultural ideology were very much in flux, women had significant opportunity to not only mold the institutions of the museum and art criticism, but also to use these spaces to fashion the identity of the modern bourgeois woman. Today, I will be highlighting several individuals, real and fictive, artifacts and episodes that show how women attempted to capitalize on the malleability of the art world at this historic juncture. And I will be giving most of the attention to those whose lives and art hewed closer to the disruptive, maybe even subversive, in the name of creating a more egalitarian art world and a more progressive society. Women artists' unprecedented public visibility from their artworks in the biannual exhibitions of contemporary art, known as the Salon with a capital S, to a prominent place in popular literature and art meant that these figures were one of the it girls of the era. Women's journals, such as the Journal des Dames et des Modes, the Petit Magasin des Dames, and the Almanach des Dames, were filled with artist biographies, exhibition reviews, and letters to the editor regarding matters of art. Fashion plates that accompanied these publications occasionally featured women in the acts of sketching, painting, and viewing art. Representations of the woman artist abound. There are at least 6 easel-sized paintings produced alone by artist Louis-Léopold Boilly, the preeminent genre painter of the day, and the woman artist became a fashionable trope in portraits, as exemplified in Boilly's portrait of the Oberkampf family and Marie-Denise Viller's young woman drawing. The publicness of women artists and professional opportunities available to them during this era were unprecedented, and they would not be matched until the end of the 19th century. Whereas only 3 women had participated in the 1789 Salon, 50 women participated in the exhibition of 1806, an increase in women's participation of over 1,600% in 17 years. Additionally, the Napoleonic government began granting awards and pensions to artists, including a few women, thus raising the profile of these figures and encouraging the founding of schools devoted to women's art education. The world was all abuzz about this development. One woman critic celebrated the high caliber of women artists' work that year by noting rather acerbically, quote, "You would like incredulous sirs to be their creators, but without you, and in spite of you, these pretty children will enter into posterity named after their mothers." Of this phenomenon, the conservative art critic Pierre Chaussard was less enthusiastic, writing in 1806, quote, "The Salon booklet offers no less than 50 women or young women painters, some more and others less distinguished by their talent. Never have there been so many displayed all at once, and I do not know if it is well to wish for their sex, for society in general, and for art, that this influence be held up." Lauded by some, rude by others, the ascendancy of the woman artist was an undeniable feature of post-revolutionary France. Caricatures of the woman artist betray the cultural anxiety this figure could provoke. The print Mademoiselle Pastel, followed by her mother, is case in point. Here, the aspiring young woman artist is the object of derision. Her careful toilette indicates that she is keen to be studied. Her left hand pulling back her skirt so as to draw its fabric against her shapely leg, with her reticule or purse, the latest trendy accessory, being used to hold tools of a trade in which she is merely role-playing. In her hand is a canvas featuring a group of unsavory characters. If I had to make a guess, I would say lecherous monk and evil procuress. Her mother is presented as a tired hag struggling to carry her daughter's easel, stool, and other paraphernalia, more beast of burden than honored parent. Popular prints such as this one attempted to undercut the scores of earnest and capable young women who were training as artists, and attest to the worry this figure generated. A brief look at 2 preeminent women artists of the era, Marguerite Gérard and Constance Maillard, is instructive to understanding the social and professional prescriptions that women had to navigate. Gérard stayed in her lane, so to speak, churning out genre paintings of the fashionable bourgeois mother that met with critical and commercial success. Maillard's ambitions to be a history painter were more problematic. Her large-scale self-portraits and her allegorical paintings, like The Sleep of Venus and Cupid or Dream of Happiness, were characterized as too ambitious. And the artist's tragic death by suicide in 1821 was the final act in a life riddled with difficulty. As we well know, a high price is often exacted from those who go against the grain. Not only were women making mischief on the walls of the Musée Napoléon, they were also enlivening its halls with their presence as spectators. Fashionably dressed, conversing animatedly with companions, shown in postures intimating their earnest engagement with the art before them, some completely focused on sketching or painting, these women became bourgeois in part through their cumulative acts of the accomplished woman of art. Sketches such as Robert's Women Entering the Museum or Print of the Public, filled with lots of women leaving the Salon of 1814, speak to this. Because the field of art criticism was not yet institutionalized, it lacked established conventions regarding qualifications, professional roles, or modes of communication, and this facilitated women's entree into it. Quote, "The guise of the art critic was one which might be assumed by all comers. admits Richard Wrigley, the leading scholar of turn-of-the-century art criticism. And everyone had the right to play this role, from the provincial visiting the salon for the first time to the academician with years of artistic training and aesthetic education. This surely emboldened more women to engage in the critical enterprise, although significantly, their writings were less likely to appear in the periodical press or in salon pamphlets. Instead, it was more often found embedded in novels, travelogues, correspondence, and diaries, publishing spaces in which women had a greater toehold. Women writing on art came from diverse backgrounds, used various literary approaches, published on a variety of subjects, and possessed varying degrees of competence in their critical enterprises. Several of these figures were trained as artists, whose observations were relayed in sophisticated, technical language. Extra aesthetic issues tied explicitly to politics motivated others. We know that a few of these were career writers who covered topics ranging from the arts and letters and society news to covering the crime beat in the periodical press. While some of these critics were dependent upon their pen for their livelihood, others were from the privileged classes. And while a few of these women adopted a strident tenor to command respect, there were certainly instances in which the woman art critic undermined her own efforts. A survey of women writing art criticism reveals an extraordinary richness and diversity that defies generalizations. In writing about art, women illuminated such issues as education and training, mobility within public spaces, class formation, and other subjects germane to the molding of women's identities. Emerging from this discourse are several leitmotifs: female desire, exasperation at the consternation regarding women viewing representations of the nude, and a keen understanding of how art criticism could be instrumentalized to question political and social practices. The question of women's desire is a recurring theme in the 9 salon critiques of Caroline Vuillet, one of the most talked about women art critics of the day. A formal musical protege of Marie Antoinette, Vuillet retooled herself after the war as a journalist and art critic. Not only did she invite controversy with her words, she also did this with her clothing choices. Deciding that the sartorial demands on a woman were financially disadvantageous, which they were then and they are now, she petitioned her friend Josephine Bonaparte, wife of then First Consul Napoleon, to write to the Paris prefect asking for a special dispensation that would allow Vuillet to wear pants, that is to say, to dress like a man. A fun fact, beginning in 1800, Parisian women who wanted to wear something other than a dress or a skirt had to have a pant card. And this decree stayed on the books until 2011. Sadly, the print of Vuillet en pantalon that was in circulation at the time is now lost, although I hope one day to find it. So we must be content to imagine her striding through the halls of the Louvre in such costume. Standing before François Gérard's Cupid and Psyche, the darling of the Salon 1798, Vuillet took issue with how the artist rendered the scene in which the invisible Cupid kisses the object of his affection for the first time, writing, "Women find the look of Psyche more than insignificant. Instead, it is that of astonished innocence, and she reflects on the pleasure she experiences, on the voluptuous pressure of 2 caressing arms, and yet she does not yet open up. She questions herself." Putting forward what feminist theorists will later term a woman's standpoint, Vuillet highlights the lack of plausibility of Gérard's depiction of Psyche. Furthermore, she believes it important to draw the public's attention to how the artist has heightened the vulnerability of the mythological young girl and let them know how real women would feel if represented thusly, declaring, "That veil which covers is airy. We would be angry if it were stripped from us. It seems that the graces it conceals could evaporate." Countering the universal acclaim this painting had received, Vuillet declared the painting contrived and even offensive to the women viewing it. Determined to drive home that not just men but also women viewed art and that their positionality should be acknowledged, she took on Nicolas-André Monceau's Aspasia conversing with Socrates and Alcibiades. Our intrepid critic chastises the artist for its narrative weakness and inability to capture the true character of Aspasia, a woman of great intellect and the consort of Pericles. and then offers very specific directives to the highly regarded artist Monceau on what she wanted to see in such an image. I would have liked Aspasia to have been surrounded by all the Athenian luxury, that her head had been covered with the treasures of Africa, that her draperies had been attached to her ivory shoulder by a glittering clasp. I would have liked more expression in her features, more grace in all her forms. Another woman critic, Angélique Mandou, the adopted daughter of Denis Diderot, the father of art criticism, also invoked her position as a desiring woman in her discussion of Pierre Narcisse Guérin's painting Phèdre and Hippolytus of 1802. In her correspondence with the wealthy German art patron Grimm, Van Duel lingered over the descriptions of its male figures, writing, "Theseus is dressed in a white tunic which exposes his neck, all of his collarbone, and his left shoulder. His green cloak has half fallen off. One of his legs is completely uncovered. Hippolytus is opposite him. His tunic allows us to see his lower thighs and his entire legs. Nothing excites, as you can imagine, the general attention, and especially that of women, as Hippolytus. And hence a somewhat unexpected cultural trope came to the fore, the homme fatale. You heard of the femme fatale, the archetypal figure who haunts the imaginaries of all epics, but is most famously known for her domination of late 19th century European culture. Today, I introduce you to her counterpart. The subject of women viewing art in post-revolutionary Paris was a contentious one. One of the primary concerns related to women's exposure to the rapidly multiplying representations of the male nude, thanks to Napoleon's penchant for commandeering ancient marbles of gods and athletes from conquered lands and placing them in the parks and museums of the capital. What were the consequences of women and young girls with their fragile nerves and delicate modesty in seeing such things, critics wondered. Henri Fuseli's sketch of a woman before the Laocoon, in which the body language of stiffened arms, clenched fists, and strong torsion of the figure away from the antique marble, articulate the worries circulating about such encounters. Women seeing nudity in art and its potential to not only transgress ideals of feminine decorum, but to excite her passions to the point that she descended into irrecoverable madness, as it was then termed, got a fair amount of coverage by, sorry, this has to be said, men. Honestly, I haven't had a single instance in which a woman expressed concern about this. Jacques-Louis David's 1799 exhibition of the intervention of the Sabine women catalyzed heated debates regarding the propriety of exposing women to male nudity in art, a situation exacerbated by the use of a psyche, or mirror, that faced the painting and thus merged the literal women spectators with the pictured ones, all of whom were dressed a la grecque. Worth noting is that David's exhibitionary device not only acknowledged the presence of women as viewers, but privileged them. Although the artist quickly succumbed to public pressure and painted in some awkwardly placed weaponry to hide their warrior nakedness, David then published a defense of his use of nudity in art in the name of verisimilitude to the military practices of antiquity. As I said, a lot of ink was spilled over this matter, elevating the public's awareness of these spaces and even drawing people to them. One of the truisms of the modern art world, that controversy and sensationalism are profitable for business, proved true in Napoleonic Paris. Not everyone bought into the hype, however. In a journal article titled, "In Regards to Customs," the stock theater figures Harlequin and Argentine take up the issue of the male nude sculptures in the Tuileries Gardens and the effects on women walking about and encountering them. What is rather amusing about this is that it is only after Harlequin has droned on and on and on about the subject that he realizes Argentine had fallen asleep, which is as effective a response to boorish monologues as any I know. The widespread fretting over the implications of women's foray into viewing male nudity in art is given its richest expression in an 1807 letter to the editor of the popular periodical Le Journal des Dames et des Modes. In this riveting account titled "The Provençal before the Apollo Belvedere at the Musée Napoleon," and signed Madam Eyewitness, which was purportedly translated from a German journal and then published in this French periodical, readers were warned against the dangers of becoming enchanted before this highly celebrated Greek sculpture. The letter deserves to be quoted in its entirety. I saw her. She was a tall woman, spelt with all the attractions of early youth. Drawn in, despite myself, by her charms, my eyes followed all her movements. Arriving before the Apollo, she quivered and stopped as if struck by thunder. Little by little, a brilliant fire sparkled in her eyes, which before had been clear and steady. All her being was animated as if by electricity. One could see that she was experiencing a singular metamorphosis. After having thus contemplated the statue for some time, she began to express with pleasant confusion what she was feeling. It would be impossible to repeat more than a sense of these words, which were as follows. I dare not lift my eyes to this God. I dare not lower my eyes in front of he whose appearance makes me so happy. Is this the work of man or a divine creation? Is its model on the earth or in the heavens? You say that this is Apollo Belvedere, but what I see is not made of marble. It is a God resplendent in his glory. Leave me, you others. Leave me to satisfy myself with its beauty. Leave me to gaze and to die. At last her companion, her older sister, succeeded in wrenching her away with the help of caresses and supplications. She left in tears. One day, some months afterwards, I returned to the salon. The guard, of whom I had demanded news of the girl from Provence, told me, the poor little thing, it would have been better for her had she never seen the statues. Not long ago, she was seated here and was looking at Apollo with clasped hands. If no one were around, she would fall to her knees and cry. Other times, she would bring flowers and place them on the pedestal. One morning, when she had entered in secret, we found her inside the enclosure, on the pedestal, exhausted from crying and in a faint. The entire room was perfumed with flowers. A large veil of Indian muslin, edged in gold, tastefully draped the statue. Out of respect for the lamentable state in which this young person found herself, the public was cleared out until her parents arrived to take her home. They struggled to wrest her away. In her delirium, she declared herself a priestess of the god and wanted to stay and serve him. We have not seen her since, but she provoked too much interest to be so soon forgotten. To state the obvious, there is a fair amount of treason in these passages, and her utterance, leave me, you others, leave me to satisfy myself with its beauty, leave me to gaze and to die, is as forceful an expression of women's scopophilia as anything I've ever read. It's a cautionary tale with a message that cannot be missed. Art's potential to corrupt, even destroy women is a subject not to be taken lightly. Now, we know better than to take this letter to the editor at face value. The missives published as such are thought to be fabrications of editor Pierre Le Messenger, who is known to have ventriloquized women to assert his own masculinist positions. The lamentation that it would have been better for her had she never seen the statues is pure theater and panders to the loud and insistent cries for the circumscription of women's spectatorship. Interestingly, one of the strategies used by women viewer critics to quell anxiety circulating around the homme fatale was couching their responses in what I call rhetoric of rapture, that is to say, verbiage and attitudes long associated with Christian mysticism. The rhetoric invoked embodied responses to spiritual stimulation, grounding transformative metaphysical experiences in the material world. Its focus on the individual and her physical embodiment underscored her literal presence in the galleries, thereby furthering her legitimacy as a cultural authority. Almost without exception, women critics of this age disavowed the notion of the disinterested retinal art critic. As David Marshall has so persuasively demonstrated, this conventional conception of the art connoisseur misrepresents the actual engagement of most individuals with art and aesthetics in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Instead, most art viewers were passionately and corporeally invested in the consumption of art. The promotion of a mode of criticism that foregrounded the critic's body as a site of production is a hallmark of women claiming a place in the discourse. To return to the account of the young Provençal before the Apollo Belvedere, we see descriptors that borrow from accounts of Christian ecstasy. She becomes increasingly obsessed with this figure, even declaring herself a priestess of the god and stating that she wanted to stay and serve him. It is interesting how Robert's painting, which I show you, of this space displays several women flocking around the famed sculpture and assuming devotional postures, including a woman artist who crouches before the work, sketching. The dynamic between Christian ecstasy and the aesthetic experience is evident in a poem on Girodet's very popular Burial of Attila, written by Marguerite Victoire Labois. Upon looking at the tragic Shaktas who clings to the feet of his adored Attila, Labois recounts, "Of his tormented silence I feel complete horror. The trait that rips one apart has passed through my heart. I tremble, I want to run away, and I remain astonished. What god of the tomb holds my soul captive?" Caught up in sublime rapture, she finds herself overcome by this painting and rendered immobile by yet another divine force, again taking recourse in mystical terminology. We see this in the review of the Salon of 1808, when a woman critic with the moniker Fanny Tatillon says of her response to this same painting, quote, "What a religious feeling I experience when I look at the picture of Attila." By linking their spectatorship to religion, women critics could deepen the legitimacy of their spectatorship and art criticism. I will end my parade of disruptive museum-going women with a discussion of the two most influential women in Napoleonic Europe, Germaine de Staël and Joséphine Bonaparte. First, let's turn to Joséphine Bonaparte, whose 13-year marriage to Napoleon was annulled in 1809 so that he could remarry and produce an heir. She had 2 children from her first marriage, but the trauma of the revolution is thought to have rendered her infertile. In a little-known but truly delectable instance of women using art to expose the machinations of powerful men who treat women like pawns, we find Joséphine fashioning a collection of paintings whose collective narrative serves as a very public condemnation for Napoleon's maltreatment of her. The more precarious her position as Empress of France, the more intent she became upon stressing her aristocratic lineage and therefore right to remain on the throne. Joséphine achieved the same in part through the cultivation of art connected to the Golden Age of France and to the style troubadour or troubadour style. This mode celebrated French medieval historical subjects in a way that had distinct nationalist overtones. Troubadour paintings appealed to the former members of the Ancien Regime with their preference for monarchical historical subjects and valorization of Gothic art, architecture, and costume, thereby offering a counterculture artistic genre that could be read as a subversion of the official neoclassical style of the French state. The themes of such paintings resonated with Joséphine's personal and political experiences. Jean-Antoine Laurent's Eloise, embracing the monastic life, which Joséphine purchased just before her death in 1814, had relevance to her own situation. Indeed, her sequestering at Malmaison, which was the house outside Paris that she got as a consolation prize for being deposed, following her decree from Napoleon, was reminiscent of the great medieval woman of letters. Viewers of François Fleury Richard's Valentine of Milan, mourning the death of her husband, the Duc d'Orléans, or Jean-Baptiste Vermey's Mary, Queen of Scots, hearing her death sentence of 1814, both of which were in Joséphine's collection, would readily understand the implicit comparison between her situation and the plight of these historical women. After Joséphine's deposition, such works would serve as a visual rebuke to her former husband, who visited her frequently in Malmaison. We get a glimpse of what her picture gallery looked like in this watercolor of 1812. It bears mentioning that she had held the largest collection of contemporary art outside of the French state in Europe. So she was definitely a collector with a capital C. It would also, this gallery would also serve as a reminder to the visitors, and she had opened it up to the public almost from the outset, of Joséphine's own love story being beset by tragedy and political maneuverings. And now to the inimitable Germaine de Staël, under whose spell I have been since my days as a master's student. No woman provoked more ire and fear in the emperor than this philosopher and cultural critic, whose self-styled protagonist wreaked havoc with French aesthetics and her lover's ego in the wildly popular novel Corinne, or Italy. Staël's incarnation of a woman genius and anti-Napoleonic cultural critic constitute significant acts of resistance. In her novel, Staël created a protagonist of genius, modeled after the author, of course, who dominated every branch of knowledge, including the visual arts. This is made especially obvious in Book 8, Statues and Paintings, in which Corinne invites her new love interest, the Englishman Oswald, to accompany her on a tour of key museums and monuments in Rome that will end in her private gallery. It is a pivotal moment in both establishing the nature of the protagonist's relationship and revealing Stahl's aesthetic agenda. Filled with both original works of art and copies of contemporary masters' work, this collection is carefully crafted to critique Napoleon's immoral art practices and to propose a new aesthetic model that promotes Christian virtue and empathy. Although Stahl's Corinne does not care for contemporary French art, she has purchased 3 history paintings in the modern school. David's lifters returning to Brutus the bodies of his sons, Gerard's Belisarius, and Jean-Germain Drouet's Marius at Maiternay, as an object lesson, for when these are juxtaposed with Italian Renaissance religious art, she believes they are found wanting. Corinne/Stahl prefers this genre for its preoccupation with women's subjects, such as the Madonna or female saints, and their romantic qualities of spiritual idealization and embrace of emotion, elements missing from the modern French art world. The novel's celebration of Italy, which is associated with art and the appreciation for women's genius, and concomitant denigration of France, which is represented as a moribund, patriarchal society that stultifies individual and national growth, was an act of defiance. Her critique of Napoleon and Napoleon's France ultimately resulted in her exile from Paris, but this did little to impede her work as one of the most important critics of the empire. And I'm showing you an illustration of a purported encounter between the two, which is quite famous in the annals of Napoleonic history. When Stahl, fishing for a compliment, allegedly asked the emperor, "Who is the best woman in France?" To which he responded, "The woman who has the most children." She should have known better than to ask. Whether it is Angelique Vendul's enchantment before Guérin's seductive representation of Hippolytus in the Salon of 1802, a young girl's raptures before the Apollo Belvedere, as recounted in the 1807 issue of the Journal des Dames et des Modes, or Germaine de Staël's heroine Corinne boldly contradicting her lover's opinions on art in the novel, women were frustrating expectations regarding their engagement with not only art, but with French society. Some of these women paid dearly for their mischievousness. Germaine de Staël suffered exile, Josephine Bonaparte was disavowed by her husband, the young girl from Provence was declared mad. Corinne lost out in love and died of a broken heart, as her lover Oswald proved incapable of being with a woman of genius. But those in the audience who know the novel can take solace, or pleasure, in knowing that she had her revenge. For although Oswald went on to marry Corinne's very conventional half-sister Lucy, Corinne had begun tutoring the daughter of Oswald and Lucy in secret, instructing her protege in all of her brilliant ways with the hope that the next generation might find it more possible for women to have both genius and love. Theirs is but one chapter in the sizable tome that records the important, even necessary cultural work performed by bold women who know the value of stirring up some beautiful trouble. Thank you.